The cold Montana wind whistled through the cracks in the old farmhouse windows as Rebecca stared at her laptop screen. It was past midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. Not when the bills kept piling up on her kitchen table like autumn leaves. The ranch that had been in her family for 3 generations was slowly slipping through her fingers, one unpaid invoice at a time. Her father used to say that ranching wasn't just a job, it was a way of life. But right now that way of life felt more like a burden she could barely carry. The cattle prices had dropped again this month and the feed costs kept climbing. Every morning brought new challenges and every evening brought new worries. Rebecca rubbed her tired eyes and took another sip of cold coffee. The laptop's glow was the only light in the kitchen, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table where her grandfather had once planned his own struggles with the land. She was doing what she did every night now, searching online for any opportunity that might save the ranch, property auctions, land sales, equipment deals. She looked at everything. Most of it was way beyond her budget, but she kept looking anyway. Hope was about the only thing she had left, and she wasn't ready to give up on that just yet. That's when she saw it, a listing that made her sit up straighter in her chair. Mountain cabin and 40 acres, tax sale, starting bid $500. Rebecca blinked hard and read it again. $500? That couldn't be right. She'd been looking at land prices for months and even the worst properties went for thousands. This had to be some kind of mistake. The photos loaded slowly on her old internet connection. When they finally appeared, Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The cabin was beautiful in a rough mountain way. Thick log walls that looked like they could stand for another 100 years. A stone chimney that spoke of warm fires on cold nights. Windows that showed glimpses of towering pine trees beyond. But it was the land that really caught her attention. Rolling meadows stretched away from the cabin, perfect for grazing cattle during the summer months. A clear stream wound through the property, providing the most precious resource any rancher could ask for, reliable water. Rebecca scrolled through the details, her heart beating faster with each line. The property was about 2 hours from her ranch up in the Bitterroot Mountains. 40 acres might not sound like much to some people, but to a rancher struggling to make ends meet, it could mean the difference between survival and failure. The listing mentioned that the previous owner had died without leaving a will. The county had taken possession when the property taxes went unpaid, and now they just wanted to get it off their books. That explained the low starting price, but it still seemed too good to be true. Rebecca read through the legal description twice, making sure she understood what she was looking at. The cabin appeared to be in decent shape, built sometime in the 1970s by someone who knew what they were doing. The land was zoned for agricultural use, which meant she could legally run cattle on it. There was something else in the listing that caught her eye, a note about access complications. The description was vague, mentioning only that the property was remote and may require special arrangements for entry. Rebecca wondered what that meant, but figured it was probably just county lawyer talk for saying the road might be rough. She'd dealt with rough roads before. Growing up on a ranch had taught her how to handle a 4-wheel drive truck in just about any conditions. A little mud or snow wasn't going to stop her from checking out what might be the opportunity of a lifetime. The auction was set to run for 2 weeks, with bidding ending on a Friday afternoon. Rebecca looked at the clock. It was already Tuesday night, which meant she didn't have much time to think about it. But then again, how much thinking did she really need to do? At worst, she'd lose $500. At best, she might just save her family's ranch. Rebecca pulled out her phone and called her best friend Lucy, who lived about 20 minutes down the road. Lucy had been her friend since elementary school and knew all about the ranch's troubles. "Do you know what time it is?" Lucy answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep. "I'm sorry, but I had to call. You're not going to believe what I just found." Rebecca explained about the auction, reading the property description out loud. By the time she finished, Lucy was wide awake. 40 acres for $500? Rebecca, that's insane. There has to be something wrong with it. Maybe, Rebecca admitted. But what if there isn't? What if this is exactly what it looks like? A chance to get good land at a price I can actually afford. Lucy was quiet for a moment. She knew how hard things had been for Rebecca since her father passed away 3 years ago. The ranch had been struggling even then, but at least there had been 2 people to share the workload. Now Rebecca was trying to do everything herself and it was wearing her down. "What does your gut tell you?" Lucy finally asked. Rebecca looked out the kitchen window at the dark fields where her cattle were sleeping. In the morning, she'd have to check on them, fix whatever had broken during the night, and somehow find a way to stretch her dwindling bank account to cover feed for another week. My gut tells me I don't have much choice. I need more land and I need water rights. This property has both. Then bid on it, Lucy said simply. But be smart about it. Don't get into a bidding war you can't afford. After hanging up, Rebecca sat in the quiet kitchen for another hour, thinking. The smart thing would probably be to drive up and look at the property before placing a bid. But gas was expensive, and she couldn't afford to take a whole day away from the ranch unless she was serious about buying. She pulled up the county records and did some research on the previous owner. His name was Theodore Blackwood, and from what she could find, he'd been something of a hermit. He'd owned the property for over 40 years, paying his taxes on time every year until the last two. The records showed he died in February during a bad snowstorm, and his body hadn't been found for several days. That explained why the property had gone to tax sale, but it also made Rebecca a little sad. Theodore must have loved that land to live on it for so long, all by himself up in the mountains. Now strangers would bid on it like it was just another piece of real estate. Rebecca thought about her own connection to the land. Her grandfather had homesteaded their current ranch back in the 1940s, building it from nothing into something that could support a family. Her father had expanded it, adding more cattle and better facilities. Now it was her turn to carry on that legacy, but she couldn't do it without taking some risks. The next morning, Rebecca was up before dawn as usual, taking care of the animals and checking fences. But instead of her usual worry about money, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Excitement. Maybe even hope. She called the county office during her lunch break to ask about the auction process. The clerk was helpful but not encouraging. That's the Blackwood place, the woman said when Rebecca mentioned the property. Beautiful land, but it's way up there. You sure you want to mess with something that remote? Remote doesn't scare me, Rebecca replied. I'm used to being on my own. Well, it's more than just being remote, the clerk said, her voice taking on a cautious tone. That mountain has its own way of doing things, if you know what I mean. Theodore lived up there for 40 years without any trouble, but he understood the mountain. Rebecca wasn't sure what that meant, but she didn't want to sound ignorant by asking. I'm just interested in using it for summer grazing, she said. Might work out fine then, the clerk replied, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. The bidding's online and you'll need to register with a credit card. If you win, you've got 30 days to complete the purchase. That afternoon, Rebecca registered for the auction and placed her opening bid of $500. The website showed that 2 other people had also registered, but no one else had bid yet. She tried not to get her hopes up, but it was hard not to imagine what 40 acres of mountain meadows could mean for her struggling herd. Over the next few days, Rebecca found herself checking the auction site constantly. By Thursday, someone had bid $600. By Friday morning, it was up to $750. Rebecca's heart sank a little. She could afford more, but not much more. At exactly 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, Rebecca sat at her computer with sweaty palms and placed what she hoped would be her winning bid, $1,000. It was more than she'd planned to spend, but still far less than the land was worth. The auction ended at 5 o'clock. Rebecca spent those last 2 hours trying to work around the ranch, but she couldn't concentrate on anything. Every few minutes, she'd run back to the house to check if anyone had outbid her. At 4:45, someone bid $1,100. Rebecca's stomach dropped, but she quickly placed a counterbid of $1,200. That was really pushing her budget, but she'd come too far to give up now. The final 15 minutes felt like hours. Rebecca stared at the screen, refreshing it every few seconds. At 4:58, the other bidder tried once more with $1,300. Rebecca's hands shook as she typed in her final offer, $1,400. The clock hit 5 o'clock and the auction ended. Rebecca had won. For a moment, she just sat there staring at the screen, not quite believing it was real. Then she let out a whoop that probably... The mountain road was rougher than Rebecca had expected, but her truck handled it well enough. She'd been driving for almost 2 hours, following the directions the county had given her, and the last 30 minutes had been nothing but dirt roads winding through thick forest. Her GPS had given up trying to track her location about 20 minutes ago. leaving her to rely on the hand-drawn map the county clerk had provided. According to the map, she should be getting close to the turnoff for Theodore Blackwood's old place. Her place now, she reminded herself with a little thrill. The forest was beautiful in a way that made her understand why someone might want to live up here all alone. Massive pine trees stretched up toward the sky, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the morning sun. Every now and then, she'd catch a glimpse of snow-capped peaks in the distance, reminding her just how high up she'd climbed. A rusty mailbox appeared around the next bend, leaning at an angle like it had been there for decades. The name Blackwood was painted on the side in faded letters, barely visible under years of weather damage. This had to be it. Rebecca pulled over and checked the map one more time. According to the drawing, she needed to follow a narrow trail that branched off from the main road here. She could see tire tracks leading into the trees, but they looked old and overgrown. The trail was barely wide enough for her truck, with tree branches scraping against the windows on both sides. Rebecca drove slowly, watching for rocks or fallen logs that might damage her vehicle. This was definitely what the county had meant by access complications, but it wasn't anything she couldn't handle. The trail wound upward through the forest, crossing a couple of small streams where someone had built rough log bridges. Rebecca had to admire the workmanship. Whoever had built these bridges knew what they were doing. They looked sturdy enough to last for years with minimal maintenance. After about 10 minutes of careful driving, the trail began to level out. Rebecca could see daylight ahead, suggesting that the thick forest was about to open up. Her excitement grew as she imagined getting her first real look at the property she'd bought sight unseen. The trees suddenly gave way to a small clearing, and Rebecca got her first glimpse of the mountain meadows she'd seen in the auction photos. They were even more beautiful in person, rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers, surrounded by towering peaks that still had snow on their highest ridges. But Rebecca didn't have time to appreciate the view, because there was something blocking the trail ahead of her. Actually, it wasn't something. It was someone. Rebecca had never seen a human being that large in her entire life. The man standing in the middle of the trail had to be at least 7 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire width of the path. He wore a faded red flannel shirt that looked like it had seen years of hard use, work boots that had probably walked thousands of mountain miles, and jeans that were clean but well worn. His hair was long and gray, pulled back in a ponytail that reached halfway down his back. His beard was the same steel gray color and hung down to the middle of his chest. But it was his eyes that really caught Rebecca's attention, pale blue like winter ice, and absolutely steady as they watched her truck approach. Rebecca stopped about 20 feet away from the giant, her heart beating fast. This definitely wasn't something the county clerk had mentioned. She turned off the engine and sat in her truck for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. The man didn't move. He just stood there in the middle of the trail, watching her with those ice-blue eyes. His expression wasn't angry or threatening exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. He looked like someone who was used to being exactly where he wanted to be, when he wanted to be there. Rebecca took a deep breath and opened her truck door. She'd dealt with difficult people before. Ranching taught you how to handle all kinds of situations. But as she stepped out of the truck and got a better sense of just how big this man really was, she felt smaller than she had since she was a child. "Excuse me?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to get through here. I just bought this property." The giant tilted his head slightly like he was considering her words. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly quiet for such a large man, but it carried clearly across the clearing. "Turn around," he said simply. "This land ain't for you." Rebecca felt a flash of irritation. She'd driven 2 hours to get here, spent $1,400 she could barely afford, and dealt with enough legal paperwork to choke a horse. She wasn't about to be turned away by some mountain man, no matter how big he was. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said, walking closer but keeping a respectful distance. "I legally purchased this property from the county. I have all the paperwork right here." She gestured toward her truck where she'd brought copies of the deed and all the auction documents. The giant watched her movement but didn't seem impressed by her mention of legal paperwork. "Name's Garrett," he said, as if that explained everything. "Been Theodore's friend for 40 years. Promised him I'd keep folks like you away from his place." "Folks like me?" Rebecca asked, genuinely confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" Garrett studied her for a long moment. taking in her worn ranch clothes, her work boots, and the calluses on her hands. His expression softened slightly, but his position in the middle of the trail didn't change. City folks who think they can buy a piece of mountain and turn it into something it ain't, he said. Developers who want to cut down the trees and build fancy houses. People who don't understand what this place really is. Rebecca almost laughed but caught herself. I'm not a city person or a developer. I'm a rancher. I bought this land because I need summer grazing for my cattle. That's what they all say, Garrett replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced of his own words. Theodore spent his whole life protecting this mountain from people who wanted to change it. Made me promise to keep doing that after he was gone. When did he die? Rebecca asked, genuinely curious now. Garrett's expression grew sad. February. Bad snowstorm came through and Theodore was up on his roof trying to fix some loose shingles. Fell and broke his neck. I found him 3 days later when I came to check on him. Rebecca felt a pang of sympathy. Losing a friend you'd known for 40 years couldn't be easy, especially when you lived in isolation like Garrett apparently did. But that didn't change the fact that she owned this property now. I'm sorry for your loss, she said sincerely, but Theodore is gone, and the county sold his land to pay back taxes. I bought it fair and square. County don't understand mountain law, Garrett said firmly. Theodore wanted this place protected. That's all that matters to me. Rebecca was starting to realize that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. Garrett seemed genuinely convinced that he had some kind of moral authority over the property, regardless of what any legal documents might say. Look, she said, trying a different approach. I'm not here to hurt anything. I just want to bring some cattle up here during the summer months to graze in these meadows. That's probably not much different from what Theodore was doing. Theodore didn't run cattle, Garrett said. He lived quiet, kept to himself, didn't disturb the mountain's ways. But the land is zoned for agricultural use, Rebecca pointed out. The county records show it's been used for livestock in the past. Garrett shrugged, clearly unimpressed by zoning laws or county records. Don't matter what some papers say. What matters is keeping this place the way Theodore wanted it. Rebecca was starting to get frustrated. She'd spent money she couldn't really afford on this property, and now some self-appointed guardian was trying to keep her from even seeing what she'd bought. It wasn't fair and it wasn't legal. I understand you want to honor your friend's memory, she said, trying to keep her voice calm, but you can't just block access to private property. I could call the sheriff if I have to. For the first time, Garrett's expression showed something that might have been amusement. Sheriff's a good man, but he's got more sense than to come up here and try to settle mountain business. Some things are between the mountain and the people who live on it. Rebecca realized she was dealing with someone who operated by a completely different set of rules than she was used to. In her world, ownership was determined by deeds and legal documents. In Garrett's world, it seemed to be determined by promises made to dead friends and some kind of mystical connection to the land itself. Can I at least see the cabin? She asked. I've never even been inside the place I bought. Garrett considered this for a long moment. Rebecca could almost see him weighing different options in his mind. Finally, he shook his head. Not today, he said. Maybe not ever. Depends on whether you can prove you understand what this place really means. And how exactly am I supposed to do that? Rebecca asked. That's for you to figure out, Garrett replied. Theodore always said the mountain decides who belongs here and who doesn't. So far, mountain don't seem to think you belong. Rebecca wanted to argue that mountains don't make decisions about property ownership, but something in Garrett's tone made her hold back. This wasn't just about legal rights or even friendship loyalty. This was about something deeper that she didn't fully understand yet. Where do you live? She asked instead. Rebecca spent the entire drive home thinking about her encounter with Garrett. By the time she pulled into her ranch yard, she'd gone through every emotion from anger to confusion to something that might have been respect. The man was certainly dedicated to his promise, even if his methods were completely illegal. That evening, she called her friend Lucy to tell her what had happened. Lucy listened to the whole story without interrupting, which Rebecca appreciated. She needed to talk through the situation with someone who would give her honest advice. So let me get this straight, Lucy said when Rebecca finished. You bought mountain property from the county, but there's a giant man living nearby who thinks he has the right to keep you off your own land? That's about the size of it, Rebecca replied. He says he promised the previous owner he'd protect the place from outsiders. But you're not an outsider anymore. You own it. Try explaining that to Garrett. He seems to think legal ownership doesn't matter compared to some kind of mountain code I've never heard of. Lucy was quiet for a moment. You know, my Uncle Pete used to hunt up in those mountains before his knees got too bad. He always said the people who live up there year-round are different from regular folks. They've got their own way of doing things. Different how? Well, they don't trust government much for one thing. And they don't like change. Some of them have been living the same way for generations, and they get suspicious when new people show up trying to alter things. Rebecca thought about that. But I'm not trying to alter anything. I just want to use the land for what it's designed for, grazing livestock. I know that, and you know that, Lucy said. But this Garrett fellow doesn't know you from any other person who might want to buy mountain land. He's probably seen developers come through before making promises they didn't keep. That gave Rebecca an idea. Maybe I need to show him I'm different. Prove that I understand and respect what the land means. How are you going to do that if he won't let you on the property? It was a good question, and Rebecca didn't have a good answer yet. But she was determined to find one. The next morning, Rebecca made some phone calls. First, she contacted the sheriff's office to ask about the situation. The deputy who answered was polite but not particularly helpful. Well, technically, if he's not on your property, there's not much we can do, the deputy explained. And even if he was trespassing, you'd have to file a formal complaint and be willing to testify in court. What about blocking access to private property? That gets complicated in the mountains, the deputy said. Sometimes there are old easements or access rights that aren't clear in the modern paperwork. Plus, juries up here tend to be sympathetic to folks who've been living on the mountain for a long time. Rebecca's next call was to her lawyer, who was even less encouraging. We could pursue legal action, he said, but it would be expensive and time-consuming. Mountain property disputes can drag on for years, especially when you're dealing with someone who doesn't seem to care about conventional legal processes. So what are my options? Try to work it out directly with him, the lawyer suggested. Sometimes these situations resolve themselves once people get to know each other. That afternoon, Rebecca decided to drive back up the mountain. She wasn't sure what she'd accomplish, but sitting at home worrying wasn't getting her anywhere. This time she came prepared. She brought copies of all her property documents, photos of her ranch and cattle, and even some old pictures of her father and grandfather working the land. If Garrett wanted proof that she was a real rancher who respected the land, she'd give him all the evidence he could want. The drive up seemed shorter the second time, probably because she knew what to expect. When she reached the clearing where the trail opened up, Garrett was exactly where she'd left him the day before. He looked like he might have slept there, though Rebecca couldn't see any camping gear. You came back, he said as she got out of her truck. It wasn't a question. I told you I would, Rebecca replied. I brought some things I thought you might want to see. She pulled out a folder full of photographs and documents, walking slowly toward Garrett. He watched her approach but didn't move from his position blocking the trail. These are pictures of my ranch, Rebecca said, holding out photos of her cattle grazing in green pastures. My family's been working this land for 3 generations. My grandfather started with nothing and built it into something that could support a family. Garrett looked at the photos but didn't take them from her hands. A lot of people got pictures, he said. Don't mean they understand what they're looking at. Rebecca pulled out more photos. Her father fixing fence, her grandfather on horseback, herself as a child helping with the cattle. This is my father. He taught me that land isn't just something you own. It's something you're responsible for. You have to take care of it so it can take care of you. For the first time, Garrett seemed genuinely interested. He studied the picture of Rebecca's father, noting the weathered hands and the careful way he was repairing the fence. Your daddy's gone? Garrett asked. 3 years now, Rebecca said quietly. Heart attack during calving season. He was helping a cow deliver twins when it happened. Garrett nodded slowly. Hard time to lose somebody. Theodore went the same way, doing what he always did, taking care of what needed taking care of. Rebecca saw an opening. That's what I'm trying to do too. The ranch is struggling and I need more grazing land to make it work. I'm not trying to get rich or develop anything. I'm just trying to keep my family's legacy alive. Why this place? Garrett asked. A lot of other land for sale. Because this is what I could afford, Rebecca said honestly. And because it has what I need. Good grass and reliable water. I saw those photos online and knew it was perfect for summer grazing. Garrett considered this for a long moment. Summer grazing, you said. You wouldn't be living up here? No. I'd bring the cattle up in late spring and take them back down before the snow flies. The cabin would just be a place to stay when I need to check on them. Theodore used to say this mountain don't like crowds, Garrett said, but it don't mind honest work if it's done respectful. Rebecca felt like she was making progress, but Garrett still wasn't moving out of the way. What would it take to convince you I'm the right person for this place? Theodore spent 40 years learning the mountain's ways, Garrett replied. Can't expect you to prove yourself in one conversation. Then let me prove it over time, Rebecca said. Give me a chance to show you I can be trusted with this land. Garrett was quiet for so long that Rebecca wondered if he'd forgotten she was there. He seemed to be looking past her, studying something in the distance that she couldn't see. Theodore used to say the mountain decides who belongs and who doesn't. He finally said, maybe it's time to let the mountain have its say about you. What does that mean? Instead of answering directly, Garrett stepped aside for the first time since Rebecca had met him. You can see the cabin, he said, but I'm coming with you, and you don't touch nothing without asking. Rebecca's heart jumped with excitement, but she tried to keep her expression calm. This felt like a test, and she didn't want to fail it by seeming too eager, You, she said simply. The walk to the cabin took about 15 minutes along a well-maintained trail that wound through the meadows and along the stream Rebecca had seen in the photos. Up close, the property was even more beautiful than she'd imagined. The grass was thick and green, perfect for cattle. The stream was clear and fast-moving, with deep pools that would provide reliable water even during dry spells. But it was the cabin itself that really took Rebecca's breath away. The log construction was solid and beautiful, clearly built by someone who knew traditional mountain craftsmanship. The foundation was stone, probably quarried somewhere nearby. The roof was metal, designed to shed snow efficiently. Theodore built most of this himself, Garrett said, noticing Rebecca's appreciation. Took him 3 summers, working alone mostly. I helped some with the heavy lifting. It's beautiful, Rebecca said honestly. He was a real craftsman. Garrett unlocked the front door with a key he pulled from his pocket. Theodore gave me this after his first heart attack a few years back. Wanted someone to have access in case something happened to him. The inside of the cabin was as impressive as the outside. The main room had a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire space. Hand-hewn beams supported the ceiling, and the log walls had been carefully chinked to keep out drafts. The furniture was simple but well-made, mostly built from local timber. Theodore made all this? Rebecca asked, running her hand along a beautifully crafted table. Most of it, Garrett confirmed. Man had talented hands when he wasn't drinking. Rebecca looked around the single large room that served as kitchen, dining, and living area. A loft accessed by a wooden ladder provided sleeping space. It was small but perfectly designed for someone who lived simply and close to the land. How did he make a living up here? She asked. Trapped some in winter, hunted what he needed for food, had a small garden in summer. Did carpentry work for folks in the valley when he needed cash money? Garrett paused. And he made furniture to sell to city folks who wanted something authentic. Rebecca could hear the slight mockery in Garrett's voice when he said. Rebecca's third trip up the mountain came a week later, and this time she brought more than just paperwork. She'd spent the week thinking about everything she'd learned from Garrett, and she had some ideas about how to prove herself worthy of Theodore's land. The most important thing she'd realized was that Garrett respected hard work and practical skills more than legal documents or smooth talking. Theodore had been a man who solved problems with his hands, and Garrett clearly valued that approach to life. So Rebecca came prepared to work. She'd loaded her truck with tools, a chainsaw, an axe, a shovel, and various hand tools for maintenance work. She'd also brought a thermos of coffee and sandwiches for 2 people, figuring that if she was going to spend time with Garrett, she might as well be neighborly about it. When she reached the clearing, Garrett was in his usual spot, but this time he was doing something different. He had a pile of firewood that he was splitting with an axe that looked like it weighed more than some people. The axe head was enormous, designed for a man with Garrett's size and strength. Rebecca parked her truck and got out, watching Garrett work for a moment. His technique was flawless. Each swing split the log cleanly down the middle, and he worked with the steady rhythm of someone who'd been doing this kind of work his entire life. Morning? She called out. Garrett looked up from his work, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "You're back again." "I brought coffee," Rebecca said, holding up the thermos. "And I was wondering if you could use some help with that firewood." Garrett stopped swinging the axe and studied her for a moment. "You know how to split wood?" "My father taught me when I was 12, Rebecca replied. "Said it was good exercise and built character." "Might could use some help," Garrett admitted. "Got more logs than I can handle before winter, and this old body ain't as young as it used to be." Rebecca pulled on her work gloves and walked over to the wood pile. Garrett handed her a smaller axe, one that was still substantial but better suited to her size. The first log she attempted was tougher than she'd expected. Mountain pine was harder and more knotted than the wood she was used to working with back home. But after a few tries, she found her rhythm. The physical work felt good after a week of worrying about money and livestock, and all the other problems that came with running a struggling ranch. There was something peaceful about the simple task of splitting wood, the satisfying crack as each log gave way to the axe. They worked side by side for about an hour before taking a break. Rebecca poured coffee for both of them, and they sat on a fallen log to rest and warm up. "You do good work," Garrett said, accepting the steaming cup gratefully. "Not many people know how to split wood proper anymore." "My father believed in learning practical skills," Rebecca replied. "Said you never knew when you might need to do something yourself instead of paying someone else to do it." "Smart man," Garrett agreed. Theodore was the same way. Didn't like depending on other folks for things he could do himself. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the sounds of the mountain, wind in the pine trees, the distant cry of a hawk, the babble of the stream somewhere beyond the trees. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca said eventually. Garrett nodded. "What did you do before you came up here? I mean, you must have had a life somewhere else before you decided to live on a mountain." Garrett was quiet for so long that Rebecca wondered if she'd asked something too personal. But finally he began to speak. "Was in the army for a while," he said quietly. "Vietnam. Came back in '72 and everything felt different. Cities were too loud, too crowded. People seemed angry all the time, like they'd forgotten how to just live peaceful." He paused, staring off at the distant peaks. "Found my way up here in '74. Met Theodore about 6 months later when I was trying to build my own cabin and making a mess of it. He helped me figure out what I was doing wrong." "Have you been up here ever since?" "Pretty much. Go down to the valley once in a while for supplies, but this is home now. Only place that ever felt right after the war." Rebecca understood a little better now. Garrett wasn't just protecting Theodore's memory. He was protecting a way of life that had given him peace after whatever he'd experienced in Vietnam. "Theodore never served?" she asked. "Nah, he was too young for Korea and too old for Vietnam, but he understood what it was like to need somewhere quiet to heal up from life's hard knocks." They finished their coffee and went back to splitting wood. By the time they'd worked through the entire pile, it was well past noon and both of them were thoroughly tired. "That's good work for one day," Garrett said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You've got strong hands for someone your size." "Thank you," Rebecca said, genuinely pleased by the compliment. "My father always said that good work was its own reward." "Your daddy sounds like he was a wise man," Garrett replied. "Theodore would have liked him, I think." That afternoon, Garrett did something he'd never done before. He invited Rebecca to see his own cabin. It was about a mile through the forest, connected to Theodore's place by a well-worn trail that was obviously used regularly. Garrett's cabin was smaller than Theodore's, but built with the same attention to craftsmanship and practical detail. The most striking thing about it was how neat and organized everything was. Tools hung in precise rows, firewood was stacked with mathematical precision, and every item seemed to have its own designated place. "You built this yourself?" Rebecca asked, admiring the tight joints and perfect angles. "Theodore helped some with the foundation and the roof," Garrett admitted, "but mostly it was just me and a lot of trial and error. The interior was sparse but comfortable, with handmade furniture and shelves lined with books about everything from wilderness survival to philosophy to poetry." Rebecca was surprised by the variety. She'd expected practical manuals but not volumes of classical literature. "You're a reader," she observed. "Long winters up here," Garrett explained. "Man needs something to occupy his mind when the snow's too deep to do much else." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, and Rebecca learned more about Garrett than she'd expected. He was educated, had been working on a college degree before he was drafted. He was well-read and thoughtful, with strong opinions about everything from environmental conservation to the problems with modern society. Most importantly, he genuinely loved the mountain and everything about living there. He talked about the changing seasons, the wildlife, and the way the light looked different at various times of day with the passion of someone who'd found his true calling. "Why don't you want other people up here?" Rebecca asked as the sun began to set. "It seems like there's enough room for everyone." Garrett was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "It ain't about space," he said finally. "It's about understanding. This mountain's got its own rhythm, its own way of doing things. Most people come up here wanting to change things to suit themselves instead of learning to fit in with what's already here." "What kind of changes?" "Oh, they want to cut down trees to improve their view, or build roads where roads don't belong, or bring in machinery that scares off the wildlife. They see this place as something to be conquered instead of something to be part of." Rebecca thought about that. What about Theodore? Did he fit in with the mountain's rhythm? "Theodore understood that he was a guest here," Garrett said. "He took what he needed and gave back what he could. Never tried to make the mountain into something it wasn't." "And you think I'd try to change things?" Garrett looked at her directly. "I think you might not know any better. Most people don't, even when they mean well." That gave Rebecca something to think about during the drive home. She'd been focused on proving that she was a legitimate rancher who deserved access to her own property. But maybe what Garrett really needed to see was that she understood the responsibility that came with owning land in such a pristine environment. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca established a routine. Every Saturday she'd drive up the mountain to work on projects around Theodore's property. Sometimes it was splitting firewood with Garrett. Other times it was clearing brush from the trails, repairing the small bridges, or maintaining the cabin. Garrett was always there, watching and occasionally helping. He never told her directly what to do, but he'd make suggestions about the best way to approach various tasks. Rebecca learned to pay attention to these hints. Garrett knew the mountain in ways that came from decades of experience. Slowly, she began to understand what he meant about the mountain's rhythm. There were subtle signs that told you when weather was changing, when wildlife was moving through the area, when streams were running high or low. Theodore's cabin and outbuildings had been positioned to take advantage of these natural patterns, and all the improvements he'd made worked with the landscape instead of against it. Rebecca also learned practical skills she'd never needed on her ranch down in the valley. How to predict mountain weather by watching cloud formations, how to identify different kinds of animal tracks, how to tell which trees were healthy and which ones needed to be removed before they became dangerous. Most importantly, she learned to move more quietly and observe more carefully. The mountain was full of life, but most of it was invisible to people who didn't know how to look. Under Garrett's patience, the breakthrough came in early June, when Rebecca finally brought her first cattle up to the mountain property. She'd been working with Garrett for almost 2 months by then, and their relationship had evolved into something that resembled a cautious friendship. But bringing livestock to the mountain would be the real test of whether their partnership could work. Rebecca had chosen 12 of her best-behaved cows for this trial run, animals that were used to being moved to new pastures and wouldn't panic in an unfamiliar environment. She'd also brought Duke, her oldest and most reliable herding dog, to help keep the cattle group together. The drive up the mountain took most of the morning, with Rebecca and Duke guiding the small herd along the winding roads and trails. It was slow going, but the cattle seemed to enjoy the journey, stopping frequently to graze on the rich grass that grew along the roadside. When they finally reached the property, Garrett was waiting for them, and Rebecca could see that he was genuinely curious about how this was going to work. He'd helped her prepare by checking all the fencing and making sure there were no gaps where cattle could wander off into the deeper forest. "They're good-looking animals," Garrett said, watching the cattle spread out across the meadow and begin grazing immediately, healthy and well cared for. "My father always said you could tell everything you needed to know about a rancher by looking at their cattle," Rebecca replied, feeling proud as she watched her animals settle into their new temporary home. The cattle loved the mountain pasture. The grass was richer than anything they'd experienced down in the valley, and the clear mountain air seemed to energize them. Within a few hours, they were grazing contentedly, while Duke kept a watchful eye on them from the shade of a large pine tree. "Theodore used to say this meadow was wasted without animals on it," Garrett observed, said grass was meant to be eaten, not just looked at. That comment meant more to Rebecca than Garrett probably realized. It suggested that Theodore himself might have approved of her plans for the property, which meant Garrett's opposition had been based on protecting his friend's memory rather than any fundamental objection to livestock. Over the next few days, Rebecca established a routine for caring for the cattle on the mountain. She'd drive up early each morning to check on them, count heads to make sure none had wandered off, and look for any signs of injury or illness. In the evening, she'd make another trip to move them to fresh grass and make sure they had adequate water. Garrett often joined her on these trips, and Rebecca quickly learned to value his knowledge of the mountain's patterns and rhythms. He could predict weather changes hours before they happened, knew which areas of the meadow stayed dry during rainstorms, and could identify potential problems before they became serious. "That cow there," Garrett said one morning, pointing to a black heifer that was standing apart from the rest of the herd. "She's favoring her left front foot. Might want to check for stones or cuts." Rebecca looked more closely and realized Garrett was right. The heifer was indeed putting less weight on one foot, though the limp was so subtle that Rebecca had missed it completely. They worked together to separate the heifer from the herd and examine her foot. Sure enough, there was a small stone wedged between her toes, causing discomfort but no serious damage. Once they removed it, the cow was back to normal within minutes. "How did you spot that?" Rebecca asked, genuinely impressed. 40 years of watching animals," Garrett replied. "Theodore taught me that healthy animals move a certain way. When something's different, even a little bit, it usually means something's wrong." Incidents like this happened regularly, and Rebecca found herself learning things about livestock management that she'd never known despite growing up on a ranch. Garrett had an almost supernatural ability to read animal behavior and spot potential problems before they became serious. But the real turning point in their relationship came during a severe thunderstorm in mid-June. Rebecca had driven up to check on the cattle late in the afternoon, when dark clouds began building over the western peaks. Within minutes, the weather deteriorated from partly cloudy to dangerous. Lightning flashed across the sky, and thunder echoed off the mountain faces with a sound like artillery. The wind picked up, bending the pine trees at alarming angles. Rebecca knew she needed to get the cattle to shelter, but she wasn't sure where to take them. Garrett appeared seemingly out of nowhere, materializing from the forest with the silent movement Rebecca had learned to expect from him. "Storm's going to be bad," he shouted over the wind. "Need to get them to the north meadow where there's more tree cover." Working together, they moved the frightened cattle to a more sheltered area just as the rain began falling in sheets. The pine trees provided some protection from the wind and lightning, but it was still a dangerous situation. "Cabin's closer," Garrett yelled, gesturing toward Theodore's old place. "We can wait it out there." They ran through the driving rain, arriving at the cabin soaked to the skin and breathing hard. Garrett quickly built a fire in the stone fireplace while Rebecca found towels and dry clothes that Theodore had left behind. As they sat by the fire waiting for the storm to pass, Rebecca realized something had changed between them. For the first time since they'd met, Garrett seemed to completely accept her presence on the mountain. He wasn't watching her suspiciously or questioning her decisions. He was treating her like a partner. "Thank you," Rebecca said quietly. "For helping with the cattle, I mean. I would have made some bad decisions out there if you hadn't been around." "That's what neighbors do," Garrett replied simply. "Help each other when things get rough." It was the first time he'd called her a neighbor, and Rebecca felt a warm feeling that had nothing to do with the fire. The storm passed after about an hour, leaving the mountain washed clean and smelling of pine and rain. When they went to check on the cattle, they found all 12 animals safe and sound, grazing peacefully in the aftermath of the storm. "They did well," Garrett observed. "Mountain cattle need to be tough enough to handle weather like that." "These are tough animals," Rebecca agreed, "but they're also smart enough to know when they need help." Over the following weeks, Rebecca and Garrett developed a routine that worked well for both of them. Rebecca handled the day-to-day care of the cattle, while Garrett provided knowledge and assistance when needed. In return, Rebecca helped Garrett with projects around his own cabin and shared supplies when he needed them. The partnership proved beneficial in ways Rebecca hadn't expected. Garrett's deep knowledge of the mountain helped her avoid potential problems with her livestock, while her experience with modern ranching techniques helped him improve his own small-scale farming efforts. More importantly, Rebecca discovered that Theodore's property contained resources she hadn't known about. While exploring the back areas of the land with Garrett, she found an old quarry where Theodore had apparently cut stone for his building projects. Theodore used to sell granite blocks to folks down in the valley, Garrett explained. People building fancy houses wanted real mountain stone, and Theodore had some of the best quality rock in this part of the country. Rebecca examined the quarry site and realized that the granite deposits were extensive and high quality. With proper permits and careful extraction, the stone could provide a significant source of income, enough to not only save her struggling ranch but to expand it substantially. Would Theodore have minded if I continued the quarry operation? Rebecca asked. Garrett considered the question seriously. Theodore believed in using what the mountain provided, as long as it was done respectful-like. He never took more stone than he needed, and he always left the land in good shape afterward. That summer, Rebecca began the process of obtaining permits to reopen the quarry on a small scale. The bureaucracy was complicated and time-consuming, but Garrett surprised her by offering to help navigate the local politics. "A lot of folks around here don't trust government much," he explained, "but they know me and they knew Theodore. If I tell them you're all right, they'll listen." Garrett's endorsement proved invaluable in dealing with county officials and environmental regulators. His reputation as someone who understood and protected the mountain environment carried weight with people who might otherwise have been suspicious of an outsider's plans. By late summer, Rebecca had all the necessary permits and had lined up several contractors who were eager to purchase high-quality granite for custom building projects. The income potential was substantial, enough to secure the future of her ranch and provide a comfortable living for years to come. But perhaps more importantly, she'd found a way to use the mountain property that honored Theodore's memory while meeting her own needs. The quarry operation would be small-scale and environmentally responsible. The cattle grazing would continue during the summer months, maintaining the mountain meadows in their natural state. And the cabin would serve as a base for managing both operations. As autumn approached and it came time to bring the cattle back down to the valley for winter, Rebecca realized how much her life had changed since that cold February night when she'd first seen the property listing. She'd started out looking for cheap grazing land to save her struggling ranch.